Welcome to Read 508. This week we're going to be reviewing Chapter 3, which was on assessment and intervention, and we're going to spend some time discussing assessments and some of the trends in the assessments of reading. So although we're in the beginning of the course still, it makes sense for us to talk about assessment now since we're going to start doing our tutoring with our students soon. So we're going to begin to think about some assessments that we can start doing. We're going to go over a few of them because ideally we want to get that tutoring done between week 6 and week 9, and that's coming up much faster than we think. So we're going to talk about some current trends in assessment. So as an educator, you've undoubtedly become aware that the quality of American public education has been under some fairly intense scrutiny for about the last 30 years or so. So the debate about how best to teach reading has been going on for a lot longer than that, but certainly under the current school reform movement and all of the kind of talk about how good our schools are in comparison to other countries, or how well our schools perform in comparison to one another across states, across districts. This conversation has certainly continued to stoke the fire about how best to teach reading. So knowing that obviously the assessment of reading and language arts is looms large in the standards movement and in the world of school reform. So probably one of the most significant influences on public education and on reading instruction has been the standards movement. In about the late 1980s, there began this push for states to begin to adopt content standards. So if you were a student in California, or you were teaching in California in the late 80s, I'm sure you remember when California, we were one of the first states, but when California came out with their first set of state standards regarding language arts and math. So, like I said, California was one of the first. Other states followed, but for example, when I began teaching in New Jersey, our standards had only come in the mid to late 90s. So they were fairly new when I started teaching. But in California, they've been around much longer. So there was this push for states to adopt content standards for each subject by grade level, and of course one of the major content areas would be the English language arts, and so reading is obviously housed under there. So the reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, the ESEA, by George W. Bush was the No Child Left Behind Act. So the ESEA has been around since the 60s. It was passed first under Johnson and then has been reauthorized in different forms by any administration who needed to reauthorize it. And so No Child Left Behind was just the renaming and the reauthorization of that act. And that act is the one that gives us, and you'll learn more about this in 536, but that's the act that gives us Title I and really begins the push towards what we call compensatory education in the United States. So this reauthorization, No Child Left Behind, if you've been in education since 2000 or 2001, which you have either as a student or as a teacher, you probably have some feelings about No Child Left Behind. But rather than spend time kind of debating the merits or the lack thereof of No Child Left Behind, I think suffice it to say it's had a significant impact on how we teach and how we assess everything in the United States, and that includes reading. So due in part to differences in the rigor and performance expectations of the standards created underneath or as part of the standards movement in the United States, and some political and financial interests of various players. Kind of the most recent version of the standards-based reform movement is this push for a set of national standards. So this is where the Common Core state standards come in. If you don't have a lot of background in Common Core standards, your book was written a couple of years, 2 years ago, I guess, the version that we're using. And so they talk about how many states have adopted, etc. But as of now, there are about 43 states that are part of the Common Core state standards movement, and adoption of these standards is, of course, voluntary, and there are states that have chosen not to, Texas and Alaska, and a couple of other southern states being some of those. But there's, significant financial and political reasons to join the Common Core state standards movement. So California has been a state, obviously, that has signed on to the Common Core. But whether or not we're talking about No Child Left Behind or we're talking about the Common Core state standards, one thing that they do share is this emphasis on accountability. And so a characteristic of the accountability movement in school reform is high-stakes testing. So what do we mean by high-stakes testing? Well, a high-stakes test is a test that students take where teachers are expected to show student performance gains on all of these tests. So, sorry, I hit that by accident. So as each state adopted and wrote their own standards, each state then has their own test. So kind of as it stands now, all states are continuing pretty much to take their own tests, and then we will all convert in the next couple of years because of the adoption of the Common Core. We're going to move towards 2 versions of a national test, one that's either put out by the Smarter Balance Consortium or one that's put out by PARCC. And so they're in the development stages now. California is actually one of the states that is working on the design and the piloting of the tests. And so if you teach here in California, you're going to be likely giving those assessments in the next year or so. Folks that teach in New York gave theirs this past summer, and there was quite a lot of debate about those. I know that Pearson was really heavily involved in the writing of those, and so that was a real source of contention for many of the teachers and the teachers' unions. So it'll be interesting to see this year how that plays out. So if you could tell, I teach Read 536 also. It's kind of my class, so this is a topic that you would talk about quite a bit in Read 536, and one that I really enjoy discussing. So things you have to look forward to, right? So regardless of what kind of test we're talking about the state assessment, or we're talking about one of these new Common Core assessments, regardless of which test is given, a high stakes test or a standards test are considered formal assessment. So let's spend a little bit of time talking about what formal assessment is. There are pros and cons to giving these standardized tests in general, and those can differ depending on what type of formal assessment you're giving. So let's spend a little bit of time then talking about those types of formal assessment. So, we have what we call these norm reference tests, and if you think about a norm reference test, think about the bell curve. So these tests are quote unquote normed against a large sample of students who have taken the test. One of the reasons that you would give these tests is because they are both valid and reliable, and they get their validity and their reliability from being normed against large groups of students who have taken this test. So think about the box test, right? Before we gave the California Standards Test or the STAR, we used to give the Stanford 9, and lots of states gave the Stanford 9. So that Stanford 9 didn't necessarily reflect what was being taught in each individual classroom, in each individual state, but rather, what should third graders know as a whole? What should a fourth grader know? And then if you give all of those third graders in, all different states and all different districts that assessment, how do they fall on this bell curve, right? So the way that, so the Stanford 9 was published by a testing company. It wasn't created by the individual states. So those are, the boxed tests. So what they do is they give you either a grade equivalent or a percentile rank. So if you remember, sometimes you take an assessment, and some of the reading type assessments you give sometimes do this, but it'll say, you scored on a third grade level, so the amount of mathematics that the average third grader would know, or a percentile rank. So let's say your student or your child took the Stanford 9 and they get back this percentile rank, which is let's say 60%. So 60% means that you knew more, or you scored better on that assessment than 60% of people in your grade or in your age range. So it means still that 40% of the students know more than you did. So you scored kind of right above that middle. It does not mean that you got 60% of the questions correct, or that you got 60% of the questions kind of wrong. It just means that's where the rank is. So if the test was 100 questions, being in the 60th percentile doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the number 60 in terms of questions that you got right or wrong. It has to do with how everybody else did in comparison to you. So these kind of tests do have some limitations. They tend to raise some questions. They're good to get a kind of a good idea where students fall in comparison to one another, but they're not the kind of tests that major instructional decisions should be made off of. So, the skills that are tested on these are often not tested in context, so they, pull out vocabulary and ask students to just kind of read a sentence and name, pick, the right word that goes in it. Or they might, pull out comprehension passages or questions that aren't kind of in the context of reading and learning from a larger passage or novel. They also assume common prior knowledge coming into the test, and part of that prior knowledge includes cultural knowledge. So there's often criticism that these tests may be culturally biased, as certain groups of students tend not to do as well as other groups of students, depending on the test and the version of the test that's given. I remember a story about the Stanford 9 one year, and it was a test meant to be given to a national audience, and it was a second or third grade test, and it had pictures of trees. And so it asked, which of these trees is green all year? Well, what's funny is when you give that test to students in, let's say, California, well, lots of our trees are green all year. And so just looking at a picture of a tree with a leaf, students might not know that in some places, in second or third grade, they might not know this, that in some places the leaves fall off and there's no leaves on the tree, because we've got lots of trees here that stay green all year. So just kind of an example of how when you give a national test, there can be those differences in background knowledge and differences in experiences that students bring to the test that can be quite a limitation for them when taking it. So when you think about these norm reference tests, really think about this bell curve. And these are like the tests that we all took when we were younger, right? We didn't have the criterion reference test necessarily, which is what we're going to talk about next. We certainly didn't have them in terms of large-scale standardized assessments. So I'm actually already at my 15 minutes for this screencast, so I'm going to end, and I will pick up on the next one.